Let's talk about one of the most important concepts in all of physiology, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. If you understand this curve, truly understand it, you understand oxygen delivery. And oxygen delivery is everything in anesthesia. Let's break it down. The curve plots the relationship between two things: PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, on the x-axis, and SaO2, the percentage of hemoglobin saturated with oxygen, on the y-axis. And the shape of that relationship is not a straight line. It's an S, a sigmoid curve. And that S shape is not an accident. It is one of the most elegant designs in human physiology. Here's why it's sigmoid. Hemoglobin has four heme groups, four binding sites for oxygen. When the first oxygen molecule binds, it changes the shape of hemoglobin, makes it easier for the second oxygen to bind, which makes it easier for the third, which makes it easier for the fourth. This is cooperative binding. Low oxygen environment, hemoglobin has low affinity. High oxygen environment, hemoglobin has high affinity. The protein changes its own behavior based on its environment. That is why the curve is sigmoid, not a design flaw, a feature. Now, let's look at the two critical portions of this curve. The flat portion sits at PO2 above 60 millimeters of mercury. This is the loading zone. This is where your lungs work. Notice how flat it is up here. Even if PO2 drops from 100 to 60, saturation barely changes, stays above 90%. This is your safety margin. This is why pre-oxygenation works. The flat part of the curve protects your patient during apnea. Now, the steep portion sits between PO2 of 20 to 40 millimeters of mercury. This is the unloading zone. This is where your tissues work. Small changes in PO2 here result in large changes in saturation. Hemoglobin releases oxygen easily in this environment, which is exactly what you want at the tissue level. The tissues are low PO2. Hemoglobin unloads oxygen readily. Cells get what they need. Two different jobs, two different portions of the same curve. Now, let's talk about P50. P50 is the PO2 at which hemoglobin is 50% saturated. Normal P50, 26 to 27 millimeters of mercury. P50 tells you about affinity. Lower P50, hemoglobin needs less PO2 to load up. Higher affinity, tighter grip on oxygen. Good for loading in the lungs, bad for releasing in the tissues. Higher P50, hemoglobin needs more PO2 to load. Lower affinity, looser grip on oxygen, easier release in the tissues. Now, the curve doesn't stay in one place. It shifts, and the direction of that shift has profound clinical implications. Right shift. The curve moves to the right. P50 increases. Affinity decreases. What causes a right shift? Acidosis, increased H+, increased CO2, increased temperature, increased 2,3 BPG. Exercise. Think about your exercising muscle. It is acidotic, hot, producing CO2 furiously, exactly the environment that right shifts the curve. What does the right shift do? It makes hemoglobin release oxygen more easily to the tissues. Your working muscle needs oxygen. The right shift delivers it. This is the Bohr effect. CO2 plus water produces carbonic acid, which dissociates to H+ and bicarbonate. That H+, that acidity, reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, promotes unloading right where the tissues need it most. Left shift. The curve moves to the left. P50 decreases. Affinity increases. What causes a left shift? Alkalosis, decreased H+, decreased CO2, decreased temperature, decreased 2,3 BPG. Carbon monoxide, fetal hemoglobin. Left shift means hemoglobin holds onto oxygen more tightly. Good for loading in the lungs, bad for releasing in the tissues. This is why carbon monoxide is so deadly. CO binds hemoglobin with 200 times the affinity of oxygen. Left shifts the curve dramatically. The blood looks saturated. The pulse oximeter reads normal, but the oxygen is never getting to the tissues. And fetal hemoglobin, it has a natural left shift, higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin. This is how the fetus extracts oxygen from maternal blood across the placenta, a brilliant physiologic adaptation. Now, the oxygen content equation, CaO2 equals 1.34 times hemoglobin times SaO2 plus 0.003 times PaO2. This equation tells you the total oxygen content of arterial blood. Notice what matters most, hemoglobin. The 1.34 times hemoglobin times SaO2, this is the bound oxygen. This is what your red blood cells carry. The 0.003 times PaO2, this is dissolved oxygen, barely meaningful at normal pressures. Normal CaO2, approximately 20 milliliters per deciliter. This is why anemia matters so much. A patient with a hemoglobin of 7 and a saturation of 100% has half the oxygen carrying capacity of a patient with hemoglobin of 14. The pulse oximeter reads perfect, the oxygen content is not. And finally, the Haldane effect. Deoxygenated hemoglobin carries more CO2 than oxygenated hemoglobin. At the tissues, hemoglobin unloads oxygen, becomes deoxygenated, and simultaneously picks up CO2 to carry back to the lungs. At the lungs, hemoglobin loads oxygen, becomes oxygenated, and releases CO2 for exhalation. Oxygen loading promotes CO2 release. CO2 release promotes oxygen loading. The two gases working in perfect reciprocal harmony. Your high-yield board takeaways before you go. Know the P50, 26 to 27 millimeters of mercury. Know the normal values. SaO2 at PO260 equals approximately 90%. SaO2 at PO2 100 equals approximately 97 to 98%. Know the right shift causes: acidosis, CO2, temperature, 2,3-BPG, exercise. Promotes tissue oxygen delivery. Know the left shift causes: alkalosis, hypothermia, CO, fetal hemoglobin. Promotes oxygen loading but impairs delivery. Know the Bohr effect. CO2 and H+ promote oxygen unloading in tissues via right shift. Know the oxygen content equation. Hemoglobin is the dominant variable. Saturation matters. Hemoglobin level matters more. And know this above everything else. The pulse oximeter tells you saturation. It does not tell you oxygen content. It does not tell you hemoglobin. It does not tell you delivery. You have to know the whole curve to understand what that number actually means. Understand the curve. Understand oxygen delivery. You just watched the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve breakdown. Now, let's find out how much you actually retained. 10 questions, no shortcuts. Pause after each question if you need time to think. That's how this works. Let's go. A patient with septic shock develops a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius and severe metabolic acidosis. What happens to the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve? A. Left shift with increased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. B. Right shift with decreased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. C. No significant change. D. Complete loss of cooperative binding. Pause if you need to think. The answer is B. Right shift with decreased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. Here's why. This patient has two simultaneous right-shifting forces happening at once. Hyperthermia, 40 degrees, directly reduces hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Metabolic acidosis, increased hydrogen ion concentration, the Bohr effect. H+ binds hemoglobin, alters its structure, reduces its grip on oxygen, promotes release to the tissues. In sepsis, where tissues are desperately consuming oxygen, this right shift is actually a compensatory response. The body trying to deliver more oxygen to struggling tissues. Right shift mnemonic: increased temperature, increased CO2, increased H+, acidosis, increased 2,3-DPG, exercise. Which condition is most associated with a leftward shift of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve? A. Chronic anemia, B. Hypercapnia, C. Fetal hemoglobin, D. Sepsis. The answer is C. Fetal hemoglobin. Here's why. Fetal hemoglobin contains gamma subunits instead of beta subunits. This structural difference means fetal hemoglobin binds 2,3-DPG much less effectively than adult hemoglobin. 2,3-DPG normally promotes oxygen unloading, a right shift. Without effective 2,3-DPG binding, fetal hemoglobin has higher affinity for oxygen, left-shifted curve, lower P50. This is physiologically brilliant. At the placenta, maternal blood arrives partially deoxygenated. PO2 is low. Fetal hemoglobin's higher affinity allows it to extract oxygen from maternal hemoglobin at these low PO2 values, pulling oxygen across the placenta from mother to fetus, an elegant design. The P50 value represents A. The PaO2 required to achieve 50% hemoglobin saturation, B. The oxygen content of arterial blood at 50 millimeters of mercury, C. The partial pressure at which dissolved oxygen equals bound oxygen, D. The PaCO2 required for 50% desaturation. The answer is A. The PaO2 required to achieve 50% hemoglobin saturation. Here's why. P50 is a single reference point on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. It tells you the PaO2 at which exactly 50% of hemoglobin binding sites are occupied with oxygen. Normal P50, 26 to 27 millimeters of mercury. Increased P50 needs more PO2 to reach 50%, lower affinity, right shift. Decreased P50 needs less PO2 to reach 50%, higher affinity, left shift. This is your single number summary of where the curve sits. Memorize this relationship. It is the foundation of every curve shift question on boards. During hypothermic cardiopulmonary bypass, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve primarily shifts. A. Right due to increased oxygen extraction. B. Left due to increased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. C. Right due to decreased 2,3-DPGD. Left due to hypercapnia. The answer is B. Left due to increased hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. Here's why. Hypothermia is one of the most powerful left-shifting conditions in clinical anesthesia. Cold temperature stabilizes the hemoglobin-oxygen bond. Hemoglobin holds on to oxygen more tightly. Left shift, decreased P50. During deep hypothermic bypass, temperatures dropping to 18 or even 15 degrees, this left shift is profound. The clinical paradox, hypothermia dramatically reduces metabolic rate and oxygen demand. That reduced demand typically outweighs the impaired unloading. This is the whole rationale for hypothermic organ protection, buying time by slowing the metabolism down faster than the curve impairs oxygen delivery. Which factor causes the most significant rightward shift of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve during exercise? A. Decreased cardiac output. B. Decreased mixed venous oxygen saturation. C. Increased hydrogen ion concentration. D. Increased hemoglobin concentration. The answer is C. Increased hydrogen ion concentration. Here's why. During exercise, metabolically active muscle creates a perfect storm of right-shifting conditions. CO2 production surges. That CO2 reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which dissociates to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Hydrogen ions, the Bohr effect in real time, bind to hemoglobin, reduce its affinity for oxygen, shift the curve right, cause hemoglobin to unload oxygen right where the muscle needs it most. Among all right-shifting factors, increased hydrogen ion concentration is the most significant driver during acute exercise. Immediate, proportional to metabolic activity, precisely targeted to the tissues consuming the most oxygen. The body's delivery system responding in real time to exactly where oxygen is needed. Carbon monoxide poisoning causes which change in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve? A. Right shift with increased oxygen unloading. B. Left shift with impaired oxygen unloading. C. No change in affinity. D. Biphasic shift depending on FiO2. The answer is B. Left shift with impaired oxygen unloading. Here's why. Carbon monoxide binds hemoglobin with approximately 200 to 250 times the affinity of oxygen. When CO occupies hemoglobin binding sites, two things happen simultaneously. First, those sites are permanently blocked. Oxygen carrying capacity is reduced. Second, and this is the insidious part, the CO binding changes the shape of the hemoglobin tetramer. The remaining oxygen binding sites develop increased affinity, left shift. Hemoglobin loads oxygen but will not release it. The blood carries oxygen. The pulse oximeter reads high because standard pulse oximetry cannot distinguish oxyhemoglobin from carboxyhemoglobin. Your patient's saturation reads 99%, and they are dying from tissue hypoxia. This is why CO poisoning requires co-oximetry to diagnose, not standard pulse oximetry, and why 100% oxygen is the cornerstone of treatment. High FiO2 competitively displaces CO from hemoglobin over time. Which statement best explains the sigmoidal shape of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve? A. Hemoglobin irreversibly binds oxygen at low PaO2. B. Oxygen dissolves non-linearly in plasma. C. Cooperative binding increases oxygen affinity as saturation rises. D. Oxygen transport depends entirely on cardiac output. The answer is C. Cooperative binding increases oxygen affinity as saturation rises. Here's why. Hemoglobin is a tetramer, 4 subunits, 4 heme groups, 4 binding sites. In its deoxygenated form, hemoglobin is in the 10th state, T state, low affinity. When the first oxygen binds, it shifts hemoglobin toward the relaxed state, R state, higher affinity. Easier for the second oxygen to bind, which makes the third easier, which makes the fourth easier. Each binding event makes the next one more likely. This is cooperative binding. The result is the S-curve. Low PO2, flat bottom. Hemoglobin reluctant to load. Rising PO2, steep middle. Cooperative binding accelerates saturation. High PO2, flat top. Hemoglobin nearly fully loaded. Adding more PO2 adds little saturation. 2 flat portions, 1 steep middle. The sigmoid curve. Perfectly matched to the physiology. Loading in the high PO2 lungs, releasing in the low PO2 tissues. A patient receives multiple units of stored packed red blood cells. Immediately after transfusion, oxygen unloading may be impaired because stored blood has A. Increased 2,3-DPG levels, B. Increased ATP concentration, C. Reduced 2,3-DPG concentration, D. Elevated fetal hemoglobin levels. The answer is C. Reduced 2,3-DPG concentration. Here's why. Red blood cells are stored in refrigerated preservative solution. Cold storage dramatically slows glycolytic activity in the red cells. 2,3-DPG is produced by the glycolytic pathway. When glycolysis slows, 2,3-DPG production slows. Levels begin declining within the first week of storage. By 2 to 3 weeks, 2,3-DPG may be less than 10% of normal. Without 2,3-DPG, hemoglobin affinity for oxygen increases. Left shift. Transfused red cells load oxygen in the lungs perfectly, but release it poorly at the tissues. The good news, once transfused cells enter circulation, 2,3-DPG regenerates within 24 to 48 hours. But in the immediate post-transfusion period, especially massive hemorrhage, this impaired unloading contributes to ongoing tissue hypoxia, even with a rising hemoglobin level. Treating the number is not the same as treating the patient. Which condition produces both a leftward shift and decreased P50? A. Hyperthermia. B. Acidosis. C. Increased 2,3-DPGD. Methemoglobinemia. The answer is D. Methemoglobinemia. Here's why. Methemoglobin forms when iron in hemoglobin is oxidized from ferrous, Fe2+, to ferric state, Fe3+. In the ferric state, that site cannot bind oxygen at all. But here's the Bohr critical mechanism. The methemoglobin subunits alter the configuration of the entire hemoglobin tetramer. The remaining normal subunits develop increased oxygen affinity. Left shift, decreased P50. Double impairment of oxygen delivery. Fewer sites available to carry oxygen, and the remaining sites hold on too tightly to release it. Clinically, standard pulse oximetry reads methemoglobin as approximately 85% saturation, regardless of the actual level. Co-oximetry required for diagnosis. Treatment, methylene blue. Board pearl, methemoglobinemia. Left shift, decreased P50. Co-oximetry, methylene blue. Why does the plateau portion of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve have major physiologic importance? A. Small decreases in PaO2 produce large drops in saturation. B. It allows stable oxygen saturation despite moderate decreases in PaO2. C. Oxygen unloading dramatically increases above 60 millimeters of mercury. D. Hemoglobin becomes fully saturated only above 300 millimeters of mercury. The answer is B. It allows stable oxygen saturation despite moderate decreases in PaO2. Here's why. The plateau sits at PO2 above approximately 60 millimeters of mercury. In this region, the curve is nearly flat. Even if PaO2 drops from 100 to 60, saturation stays above 90%. This is the physiologic safety margin. This is why pre-oxygenation works. This is why healthy patients tolerate moderate altitude without significant symptoms. But the plateau also hides danger. Because the curve is flat at the top, saturation stays reassuringly high while PaO2 is dropping silently. By the time saturation starts falling significantly, you are already on the steep portion. On the steep portion, small drops in PaO2 cause large drops in saturation. The cliff arrives fast. This is why the pulse oximeter does not warn you early enough during apnea, and why you never let a normal saturation reading make you complacent about an apneic patient. The plateau is your friend, until you fall off the edge. That's 10 questions. 10 board-level concepts on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Your 5 things to lock in before you go. P50 is 26 to 27 millimeters of mercury. Right shift, hot, acidotic, high CO2, high 2,3-DPG. Exercise, promotes tissue oxygen delivery. Left shift, cold, alkalotic, CO, fetal hemoglobin, methemoglobin, impairs tissue oxygen delivery. Stored blood loses 2,3-DPG. Left shifted immediately after transfusion. The plateau protects saturation, but masks a falling PaO2. Screenshot that. Save it. I'm Anesthesia Buddy. Stay sharp. See you in the next one.